Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me as we continue with our series on the topic of relevance. Today's message is on relevant Jesus, and our passage of scripture comes from Mark 2:27 and Matthew 5:43 through 44. And then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. You have heard it said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy,' but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." God bless the reading of his word, the word of God for the people of God. Setting an example. Trent looked at his watch. He was going to be late opening up the station. The young man hated it when his parts pickup route took him longer than expected. His dad wasn't going to be happy, but hey, it couldn't be helped. He'd driven all the way over to Ruskville to pick up the rebuilt transmission for Mrs. Bernaski's minivan, and when he got there, the parts store wasn't even open yet. Seems they were running late as well, and by the time he got the transmission loaded onto the tow truck, he was already running a half hour behind schedule. It couldn't be helped. That never would have happened to his brother Junior. Trent loved his brother. The boys were 10 years apart, Junior being the eldest, but they had always been close. Junior had been his protector, his confidant, his companion in crimes at times. And when they had set off that firecracker in Miss Rumsfeld's backyard to scare her cat, and Trent had been allowed to tag along when Junior and his buddies used ropes to pull old Mr. Simpson's old, no longer used outhouse onto the high school roof. Junior had never treated Trent like he wasn't welcome wherever he went. But Junior also had a big secret, and only Trent knew about it. Wherever they were, Junior was always looking for ways to help people out. Only God knows how many times he got out the ladder to rescue Mrs. Rumsfeld's cat from the oak tree in her front yard without her ever knowing about it. Mrs. Rumsfeld couldn't see very well and could hear even less, so it wasn't like she would have realized what Junior was doing. Every Saturday morning, Junior would put the lawnmower and weed eater into the back of the truck and then proceed to drive around looking for yards that needed mowing. And of course, Trent was always with him when he did this. They were seldom separated. And when they spotted a lawn in need of some TLC, they would get out of the truck and get to work. They didn't do it for the money, and most of the people that they helped didn't have much to begin with and were elderly or challenged to the point where they just couldn't take care of their yard like they needed to. Seldom did anyone have anything to offer except a cold glass of water or lemonade. They would swap back and forth using the mower and the weed eater, and Trent learned from his brother how to care for people and take care of their needs without expectation of any return. Then there was that time that Doc Adams got stuck in a ditch on his way back from delivering Sarah McAllister's baby. Doc was returning to town in the middle of the night, and the roads were slick from the evening rain. He missed the curve just north of Dancer Williams' place, and Doc had called the station hoping to catch someone, and Junior had thought to forward the station phone to his own cell phone. So Junior and Trent had gotten dressed and went to the station to get the tow truck, and had gone out to pull Doc's car from the ditch. Unfortunately, the right front ball joint had taken a hit, leaving the car undrivable. So they hooked up the car and took Doc back home before taking the car to the station. Junior never charged Doc a dime for that, not even for fixing the ball joint. Nobody ever said a word except for Doc telling him how grateful he was. That was Junior. He didn't go to college, so he helped his dad, Wild Bill, run the quick stop. But when he turned 21, he informed his family that he was joining the Marines to serve his country. And just like that, Junior was off on a new adventure, but this time without his brother Trent. Although still too young to run the station for his dad, Trent knew that he could and should help in any way he could. After all, His dad was starting to get a little long in the tooth and had difficulty handling everything by himself. So Trent learned that all he could from his dad about the cars he was servicing and got to be a pretty good mechanic. And when he graduated from high school, he stuck with the shop, helping his dad, taking care of the business day in and day out. Trent was so proud of Junior, and they had talked all the time, even when Junior was stationed in Iraq. Trent kept his brother informed about how his mom and dad were doing and how the business was going. He would tell Junior about the cars he was working on, and his brother would give him a tip here and there on how to deal with something that Trent was finding tricky. But Junior never talked about his experiences in the Marines. At one point, Junior let Trent know that when he was finished with his current tour, he was going to come home. He'd done 3 tours, and it was time to let go of the military and move back home. And this thrilled Trent to no end, thinking of all the things he and his brother would do together once he got home. Trent looked up to his brother. Junior was his role model, and he wanted to become the same kind of giving, loving, sharing person that Junior was. So here he was on his way back to Parable from Ruskville with the rebuilt transmission for Mrs. Bernasky's minivan, and he thought about all that he needed to accomplish. The monthly inventory needed to be done, and the CO2 canisters for the drink machine needed to be swapped out. The food aisle needed to be restocked, and there were a few supplies he was running short of that needed to be ordered. Only then could he get to work replacing the transmission for Mrs. Bernasky. When he arrived at the station, Chester Thompson was there wanting an inspection for his Jeep, and Mabel Gallagher needed gas. Now, she couldn't pump that gas herself. She had just had her nails done and didn't want to mess them up. Trent's dad wasn't around, which is a bit strange for a Thursday morning. He had probably gone to meet the guys at Daisy's to grab a coffee and maybe gab a bit. The coffee klatch was the closest thing to getting current news in Parable. Trent filled up Mabel's Cadillac and then turned his attention to the inspection. That shouldn't take too long, and after he'd finished with Mr. Thompson and sent him on his way, he stepped behind the counter to grab his clipboard for the inventory. He decided he would check the messages before he got started. There was only one. It was from his dad telling him that he needed Trent to come home, that it was okay to close up the station for the day. Well, something was definitely going on. Other than Sundays and Christmas, the station was always open. Trent closed the garage doors and locked the front access on his way out. And driving home, he wondered what could have gotten into his dad. Maybe he didn't feel well. Maybe something had happened to his mom. No need to worry. He would find out when he got home. As he entered the front door, he heard low voices in the living room. His dad had his arms around his mom as she sobbed into his shoulder. 2 Marines stood by in their dress uniforms. He actually recognized them. He knew the guys from Junior's outfit because Junior had shown him pictures. And one stepped over to him and stood squarely in front of him and said, "Trent," he asked, "you must be Trent. Junior is always talking about you and how proud he was of you. What are you doing here?" "Where's Junior?" Trent asked, even though he already knew. "There was an accident, son," said the Marine. "A helicopter that your brother was on went down. Your brother managed to pull most of the men and women out of his before his own injuries overtook him, but he passed away in the medical chopper on the way back to base." "No, that can't be. Junior promised he was coming home," said Trent. "Trent, he did come home. We are honored to be allowed to bring him home. Even in the med chopper, all he could talk about was coming back home and all the things you two were going to do together." The weight of it all hit home. A part of Trent shriveled up and died inside of his chest as the tears started to flow, even as he mustered all of his energy to hold them back. Trent joined his dad in holding tight to his mom, and in the middle of this mess, they held on to each other for dear life. His dad pulled away and shook the hands of both Marines. Trent, still numb, realized that it was the proper thing to do. It was obvious that these men had cared deeply for his brother as well. One of the Marines said that there would be more information coming soon, protocols, steps to take, who to contact, what to do, blah, 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 blah. And then they were gone, like they had never been there. Like this, it had all been a bad dream, no, a nightmare. Trent hugged his mom and dad again, then went up to his room. Staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of it all, he prayed, hoping to find answers. After what seemed like an eternity, a certain peace came over him, and then he felt like he needed to do something. So he went to the garage and grabbed the ladder and went next door. Yes, he didn't know how he knew it, but Mrs. Rumsfeld's cat was stuck in the tree again. So he set up the ladder and brought the cat safely back to earth. On Saturday morning, he would go mow a few lawns. That's how it was supposed to be when you look up to someone so much that you want to be like them. You want to carry on with the path that they forged. That's the way their voice can still be heard in the world. One of my favorite verses is Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. To walk humbly with your God. Have you ever noticed that when people walk together, they have a tendency to walk in sync? Even when they try to walk with their own strides, they unconsciously, subconsciously begin to walk in sync. And the closer the relationship between the people, the more likely they are to walk in sync with each other. It's a natural phenomenon. It feels awkward being out of step with someone that you are walking with. Something seems a kilter, out of whack, awkward. When people dance together well, they move in unison. Even their counter steps are synchronized. Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, Gene Kelly and Rita Hayworth, Patrick Swayze and Jennifer Grey, John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John come to mind. And when watching them dance, it becomes difficult to imagine them dancing separately. Moves and counter moves blend into a singular performance. And if you could hear them talking, they would probably be completing each other's sentences. Flash mobs continue to fascinate me, especially when a large group of people meet up for only a few hours practice and then come together in a performance in a public space, whether it's dancing or playing music. And the people involved are often not trying to outdo each other, but instead allowing themselves to become part of a bigger whole in order to create a spontaneous moment in time. At least it appears that way. In large choreographed numbers where there is no lead dancer, every person strives not to stand out, but be an integral part of the total performance. Musicals like A Chorus Line, Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, West Side Story, Anything Goes, and so many more. At one point, it seemed like Hollywood was trying to get as many people dancing together inside of a single frame as possible, all moving together as one company. Now, I want to take a minute and talk about our dance with God. What is that like for us? What are you talking about, preacher? Dancing with God. It's just like what it sounds like. Each and every one of us has the ability and even the calling to dance with God, to synchronize our walk with His walk, to stay in step with our Creator. But it's also sad that so many of us choose to walk akimbo to His stride rather than with His stride. Now here's a thought for you. When you see people walking together, dancing together, singing together, even doing sports together, it generally isn't just a thing of chance. If someone, even if we can't tell who, someone is the leader. It might be someone doing the walking, or someone backstage, or someone conducting, or someone on the sidelines. Someone is doing the leading, and someone else is doing the following. That leader may be invisible to the audience, or that person can be in plain sight right up there on the podium, or even inside the performing with the dance troupe or the orchestra. But everyone involved is taking their cue from a leader, because the followers always know who the leader is. The passengers on a cruise ship may never see the captain, but they know that someone is in charge and directing the crew. There can be only one main coach, one general, one director, one choreography, one true leader, one person who is ultimately responsible for everything that is occurring. Well, I can see what you're trying to say, preacher, but what, if anything, does this have to do with the relevance of Jesus in our lives? Do you remember me telling you that it is all so sad that so many of us choose to walk akimbo to his stride rather than with his stride? What happens when a player doesn't listen to their coach? What happens when a soldier chooses not to obey their commanding officer? What happens when a cast member doesn't listen to the director, or a musician, or a singer? It really doesn't matter how skilled they are or how much they've practiced. If they don't listen to their leader, it all begins to fall apart quickly. You know, I was on a Facebook group page the other day for Christians, and someone posted the following meme. If you're struggling and your people are just sitting there watching you struggle, they're not your people. That hit me as just so wrong, that as Christians we believe that somehow. And I responded back with these words, harsh as they may sound, listen carefully. As Jesus hung on the cross, bleeding and dying, he looked out over the sea of people, most of whom had put him up there, and said, "Forgive them, Father, for they don't know what they're doing." Those people tortured him, beat him, spat on him, cursed him, put a crown of thorns on his head, and hung him on that tree. But they were still his people. I can only pray for the strength to be as forgiving and embracing of God's people as Jesus. I didn't get a lot of response when I wrote that. I know the reason. Jesus is the heart of the Christian experience, but his example makes us uncomfortable, especially when someone points out that we aren't living up to his example. How does an effective leader lead? How does that coach, officer, or director get their people to follow them? They do it by setting an example. Just as Junior sets an example for Trent in our story today. Junior never set out to be a leader for Trent, but allowing Trent to join him in his adventures and doing things that exemplified a love for people encouraged Trent to be like him. To this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. 1 Peter 2:21. You know, you can't accomplish much in this Christian life, and you will constantly be frustrated, feeling like you don't measure up if you don't let Jesus do the leading. He sets the example. He sets the pace. He orchestrates the action. He brings the vision and the plan to the game. He leads by example. He became fully human to show us how to live. I brought you two verses at the beginning of this message, and at first glance they may not seem poignant or relatable to what we're talking about. They may not seem relevant, but let's read them again. Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." And You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. We're all too quick on the draw to tell people how Jesus died on a Roman cross for our sins, was beaten, spat upon, and made to carry that cross that they nailed him to wash us clean, to purge us of all the dirt that weighs us down, to offer himself up as a living sacrifice, to make us worthy to kneel at the throne of our Creator, to make us whole, sanctified, and complete. And that's true. And that message should never be watered down. But he did more than that. And when he came to earth as a baby in a manger, he came to tell us that we've been reading from the wrong playbook, that we have been following the wrong script, that our understanding of our purpose, the purpose that had always been intended for us, was compromised by our own pride and our stiff-necked ways. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. We, God's children, are more important than the law. Let me repeat that. We, God's children, are more important than the law. If a choice has to be made between the law and loving our neighbor wins. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those that persecute you. Matthew 5:38 through 42 says, you have heard it that it was said, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. In Luke 23:46, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Father, forgive them. They're trying so hard. They just do not understand that they have been following the wrong message. They don't know how much you love them. They don't realize that the law can't save them, that the law was meant to guide them to care for each other. Put me in, Coach, so that I can show them a better way. Let my life be an example of how they should live their lives. Let me be the light in their darkness, please. Father, let me try to show them the way it's supposed to be, even if it kills me. Every one of us has 2 relevant Jesus meters in our life. Even non-believers have these. When faced with moral or dangerous dilemmas, those meters can give us information to help us make decisions. The first relevant Jesus meter is always pegged out on the side of love, no matter the situation or people involved. It is the true reflection of the heart of Jesus. Jesus always puts love and compassion first. But that meter makes people uncomfortable. It's great when we agree with it, but when it doesn't reflect our own hearts, it becomes an annoyance. The second meter is the one we create ourselves to deal with that. A meter that allows us to adjust our own perception of the first meter. It takes the value of the first meter and modifies it to reflect our own hearts as we determine the actual relevance of that first meter to the situations that we face. It gives us the leeway to adapt our response and justify our selfish desires. As Christians, We know that the first meter is the one that we should always be looking at when we make decisions to reflect the true nature of Christ in the world around us. But most of us look at that second meter first to determine if the first meter is even relevant to the situation, forgetting that the first meter is actually the only relevant meter in any situation. The second meter is driven by our own desires, our own prejudices, our own pride, our own level of courage, our own doubts, and our own selfishness. As Christians, we're called to die to self and surrender that second meter over to Christ. Lay it at the foot of the cross and walk away from it, making it irrelevant to the decisions we face. As Christians, the meter that reflects the heart of Christ is the only meter that we need to make a decision or perform an action. We should always peg out on the side of love. Now that's what I want us to think about this week as we examine the relevance of Jesus in our lives. Are we looking to him as our coach, leader, conductor, choreographer, director, our example? Or are our eyes focused somewhere else, thinking that the answers we seek will spring out from the earth rather than come down from the throne of God? Is Jesus relevant in our lives, even when everybody else tells us that he isn't, that he's outdated, that his message doesn't make sense in our chaotic world? Is the message of Jesus relevant to us in our everyday lives? I stand convinced that his message is the only relevant thing that makes any sense in this world. God bless you all. Amen.